Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. Isis, Escape from Transylvania. The goddess next door and John Haynes must escape a horde of vampires on the hunt in this horror-filled Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Escape from Transylvania in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. In a recent interview on CBS This Morning, Marvel's new editor-in-chief, C.B. Cebulski, and Marvel's director of content and character development, Sana Amanat, announced a plan to fix the boy problem at Marvel Comics. And when I heard them make this statement, they showed me how completely clueless they are as related to comic books and the history of superhero comics. Now, when it comes down to superhero comic books have always been targeted towards boys. And they've been targeted towards boys for a reason, because the superhero comic book was the evolution of pulp fiction. Now, pulp fiction back in the early 1930s featured two characters, Doc Savage and the Shadow. And these two characters were the grandfather for all modern comic book superheroes that we see today. In fact, Doc Savage called himself Superman, and your Doc Savage's real name was Clark, and he had a Fortress of Solitude. And your Shadow, on the other hand, he was a dark and ominous character. And both of these characters, in their stories, laid down the foundation for everything that we see in modern superhero comics. And both of these characters, in their pulp fiction stories, which cost 10 cents and were sold at 5 and dime stores and drugstores during the early 1930s, were targeted towards young boys, because young boys liked action and adventure, because that's what they usually saw, not only in these movies like your Tarzans or your serial movies like your Durango Kid and many other westerns, but this is what they saw, and this was what was targeted towards them. So for Sana Amanat and your C.B. Cebulski to say they're going to fix a boy problem shows that they really don't have an understanding of comic books or the history of comic books or the history of superhero comics like Marvel Comics. Now, when it comes down to superhero comics were primarily created by men in order to sell stories to young boys, because it was boys who primarily were the ones, again, buying superhero comics, and it was boys who bought superhero comics for a reason. Now, when it comes down to boys, comic books are they're naturally attracted to comic books because they feature these brightly colored characters having fantastic action and fantastic adventures. But the educational reason why boys are attracted to comic books has to do with the way that they think and the way that they process information. Now, when it comes down to boys oftentimes they process information by being very visual. And with comic books naturally featuring stories being told in pictures, and these pictures being brightly colored, they naturally attract boys. And because boys have to read them using their hands, this is another reason why boys are naturally attracted to comic books. And boys prefer reading comic books over novels, because the comic book plays to the child's strengths. And when a boy sees a comic book, he's naturally attracted to it because, one, it is telling that story in brightly colored pictures and features brightly colored characters in action sequences, and two, it allows them to read in the way that plays to their strengths, being visual, and it also allows them to be able to read using their hands. So a comic book, superhero comic book, plays to the strengths of a boy's learning process, and this is why boys like reading comic books. Moreover, they like reading comics because it tells stories featuring strong masculine heroes in action and adventure stories. And that's another reason why boys like reading comics, because they see these muscle-bound he-men participating in these action and adventure stories, and they say to themselves, this is something I want to aspire to, this is something I want to be like, and this is something that appeals to me. And this is why boys like comic books. So there's no boy problem as related to superhero comics, because superhero comics were designed by men for boys. They were never designed for girls. Because when you look at the history of comic books, you know that there were comics made for girls. There were comics made towards their types of stories. They had stories like Archie and Betty and Veronica and Patsy Walker and romance comics. And these comics sold very well in the 30s and the 40s. However, as time passed, many of those comics tended to struggle because what happened was girls really, they don't like reading these type of comics because they don't really appeal to them, because girls are not very visual. Girls tend to be primarily analytical, and they tend to read information based in words, and they don't really like using their hands as much as boys do. They usually like to sit down and read information on a page like a book and imagine things, because that's another thing with girls. Girls imagine in their heads, whereas boys are visual. So it's a completely different thinking process, and this is why girls were naturally attracted to Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys back in the 1940s. So there's a reason why certain types of fiction sold to boys and certain types of fiction sold to girls. Now, when it comes down to girls, they're trying to make comic books for girls. However, most girls, they don't really like the superhero genre because it just does not appeal primarily to women. When it comes down to women, they like a certain type of story. Now, yes, girls like adventure. Yes, girls like action, but they like their action to have certain things and elements in their type of action. And many YA writers, they can give girls that type of action that they want. When we look at Twilight, when we look at Harry Potter, and we look at Hunger Games, they appeal to girls because they give them the type of story that they want. And one of the things that the girls want in their stories is they want their romance, and they also want to be swept away and carried away by the strong masculine hero. And that's not something we're seeing in many of these Marvel comics, which are trying to target towards women. What we're seeing in many Marvel comics is this so-called superwoman, but that doesn't really appeal to most women. Now, myself being a writer who has written stories featuring strong heroines, I know what appeals primarily to girls because I've seen the response I've gotten to East-Team series books and ISIS series books, and even books like Spellbound and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy. And usually, again, girls, they want a strong heroine, but you have to write things that relate to what they want. Now, again, the big problem at Marvel is they're trying to make super heroines for girls, but they're not understanding there's a certain story paradigm and a certain story model that girls want to see. And what they want to do is try to transpose the boys' model onto the girls, and then they're wondering why it's failing. The reason why it's failing is, one, you're trying to transpose the story model onto the girls, and then two, you're trying to write in a story that just doesn't appeal to girls, and three, you're creating characters who are mostly Mary Sues, and most girls who have read YA fiction, most girls who have read manga, they know a Mary Sue character when they see it. And when I look at characters like your Riri Williams, who's supposed to be this black female who's supposed to be like Iron Man, she's not a character with her own personality, her own voice, and her own flaws. She's a Mary Sue who can practically do anything. And when I look at Captain Marvel, the direction that they took Ms. Marvel into, she's this character who really has no personality and no voice, and she's just there to be this super strong woman, but she has no strength of character, she has no depth, she has no layers, and she has nothing there to really resonate with the viewer. And when I look at a character like your America Chavez, she's just there to be a gay Latina, but she's not there to have any sort of conflict or interest that appeal to the reader. So there's nothing there of substance there. There's a lot of flash as related to their appearance, but no substance as related to their characters. Because if you're writing heroines, you have to have a lot of substance to them, and you have to have a strong story there that can resonate with the reader. Now, when it comes down to Marvel and them saying that there's a boy problem in comics, there's no boy problem in comics. The big problem with Marvel is that they don't understand their core audience. And your core audience has been male for over 80 years. And it's been male, again, for a reason, because comic books were created, superhero comic books were created by males, for males, and the whole idea of superhero comics was made to appeal primarily to boys, because boys were the ones who went out here and they went from buying Pulp Fiction to buying superhero comics, and it was boys who went out here and built the comic book hobby into an industry back in the 1970s as people started going out to buy back issues and went out here to start going to conventions to go out here and buy old comics. And it was comic book boys who went out here and watched many of the superhero cartoon shows and went out here to watch the Saturday morning cartoon shows like your Super Friends, your Superpowers, your Marvel Action Hour, your Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and your Batman animated series and your Spider-Man animated series that came out in the 1990s. It was boys who primarily built this industry by going out here to buy comics on the regular, going to the 7-Elevens and the grocery stores, and it was boys who went out here and collected action figures like the Superpowers line back in the 1980s, the Secret Wars line back in the 1980s, and went out here and bought the 5-inch lines of the 1990s and are right now buying things like Marvel Legends and continuing to go out here and buy entire cases of figures so that they can go out here and complete things like Build-A-Figures in order to further build their collection. And that's another thing that people don't understand about boys, is that boys are natural builders. And because comic books are serialized and sequential, this is another part of why comic books appeal to boys, because boys like to build, and building their collections up by collecting all the numbers. This is another way that boys go out here and buy comic books. Because again, if with boys being a natural builder, they buy the number 1 issue, they buy the number 2 issue, they buy the number 3 issue, and what they're doing is they're building a collection. Again, this is another reason why comics appeal to boys. They appeal to boys because they play to many of the strengths of boys, and they were naturally designed to appeal to the strengths of boys. Now, girls, on the other hand, they buy a different type of product, they buy a different type of series, and they buy towards a completely different model. And when you have people at Marvel saying that there's a problem with boys, what they're doing is shooting themselves in the foot, because for over 80 years, boys have been the core customer at Marvel, and they've been the core customer because the products were designed and targeted towards boys. Now, Marvel has produced other products in its history, like the Star line for small children, and they have produced romance comics and other types of comics. Unfortunately, those comics never sold as well in the late 1960s and 1970s in the same way that superhero comics have sold. And again, the reason why superhero comics sold for Marvel is because they were designed to appeal to boys, and because boys were the core audience that they targeted. Now, when I listen to your C.B. Cebulski and your Son Ahamonat sitting there talking about there's a boy problem, what they're doing is alienating the customer base that built Marvel as a brand and made Marvel the #1 comic publisher in the world, and led to Marvel becoming one of the most popular parts of American pop culture. Because for you to say that there's a boy problem shows that you just don't understand your customer, you don't understand the history of your product, and when you have people like this working at a company, they either won't be working there for long, or they're going to drive the company straight out of business. And looking at Marvel's business model over the last 2 years, it looks like Marvel's days are numbered, because if you have people like this saying that there's a problem with your core customer, you're not going to have those customers buying your product for long. If you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct publications, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, and the upcoming John Haynes series, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Ascension, The Devil's Diva reaches a turning point in her life with this powerful E-Steam series story. Get E-Steam Ascension at online booksellers today.